What's up, guys? I wanted to do something a little different today, and so this will be part one of a series of videos on car prep for Rallycross, Rallysprint, but especially stage rally. And this is going to be the videos that I would have wanted to see a few years ago when I started building my car for stage. So Team O'Neill has a good video on high-level car prep and what they do to their cars as far as things like underbody protection. But I wanted to get a little more down in the weeds, so to speak, and talk about the things that you can do in your garage, what to do, what to avoid, what's going to cost you money, and what's actually going to work out on the stages. So we're going to be discussing prep on this car behind me. This is a 1998 Subaru Impreza, and this is kind of the culmination of all of my research and prep over the past few years to build this car. And so there's some Subaru specific things that I'm going to talk about, but most of this is going to be general. You can take this and apply it to anything you're building for a Rallycross, Rallysprint, stage rally situation. So it's on the lift right now. We'll get a little further up in the air and then we'll take a look. So we've got the car up in the air and the wheel off, and the first thing you're going to notice is that not a lot looks different from stock. There's no fancy coilover rally suspension, there's no crazy brakes, and there's a reason for that. You want to keep it simple and you want to keep stock components wherever you can to save money. A lot of people target, specifically on the Subarus, like a 4-pot, 2-pot brake upgrade, front and rear. And yeah, that's great, but you could lock up the tires just as well with 2-pot front calipers, and it's a lot cheaper to maintain, because you have to think it's not just the initial purchase price of the 4-pot, 2-pot setup, but then you have to consider you have to maintain it, and then what happens if it breaks on the first stage of a rally and you have to replace it. You have to source a spare, which may come at a premium, and if you can't source a spare, you're out for the day. So what do? You bring a spare with you. So now you have to buy an expensive 4-pot caliper as a spare for each side, and your costs to get in on the ground level just grew exponentially. Same thing for suspension. You don't need a fancy suspension and 5 inches of lift to go out there and be competitive. This is KYB AGX. These are actually adjustable four-way rebound and compression. Pretty simple adjustment, but they're cheap. It's $400 for a set of 4 struts for this car, and as long as you don't think you're Travis Pastrana and you're flying off the crests, they're going to last you just fine. So same thing here. I have just the 2 pots on the front, and these are Hawk HP Plus pads and high temp brake fluid. And it's much more important to put your money there than in an expensive brake setup and then not have money to do anything else with it. Some other things here. These are shockwear covers by Outerwear. You want a cover over the spring to keep mud and debris out, and that's really going to help extend the life of the shock so you don't get dirt and stuff past the seal. And it's also going to make your life easier when you have to clean these and take them off or switch springs. There's not really a better solution than this that I've seen. These are somewhat expensive and they don't hold up under repeated abuse at stage rally, but they're better than nothing. So another thing that we can look at here is the mud flap mounting and the wheel well mounting. So what I've used for the mud flap is actually some weld-in nuts. So that'll look something like this, and I've gotten these from McMaster. That's going to be a common source of parts throughout all of these videos. And so I'm just getting these simple steel weld-on nuts, and I'm welding them 3 places. I've actually welded them backwards here, but I've given myself a couple mount points here so I can put pads and mount the mud flap here, because you don't want to be mounting this thing with a through hole and then a nut and bolt that you have to have somebody sit on the backside in the fender well and hold this while you screw it on. And additionally, that's going to be weaker, and if you tear it off, it's going to be a nightmare to try and fix. And now you've got a hole into the interior that's going to let water in right in your footwell too if something goes wrong. So that's a great way. I've used those all over the car on the underbody. Naturally, you need a welder, and you need to be able to at least booger up some sort of weld that's going to stick that on for longer than 5 minutes to do that. So the next tool I think is really important to have, and it's an absolute lifesaver, especially if you don't have a welder, is a riv nut tool and riv nuts. And so riv nuts are threaded collapsible nuts here, and the way you use this is you're going to drill a hole in the body, and then you're going to thread the riv nut onto the arbor, the threaded arbor, and you're going to squeeze this, and it's going to collapse this and lock the riv nut in the hole that you've drilled. This is how I mount all of my stuff under the dash, in the interior, all over the car that I don't want to actually throw a weld bead on. It's about $60 on Amazon for this and a whole carrying case that comes with a bunch of different size metric riv nuts. And if you buy any sort of tool to do this, buy this tool because it will save your life. So if we actually look, the wheel well liner, which commonly gets spit out constantly on a rally car, is mounted via riv nuts now. I've actually drilled holes in the fender and pinched in riv nuts and bolted the wheel well liner on. And I've done that with all the plastic liners in the front of the car. And so far that's actually surviving extremely well. And it's going to be 1,000 times more durable than the plastic tabs that are holding these things in. And you don't want a wheel well liner coming apart on you and possibly catching the brake line and yanking things around and flying out if you can avoid it. So one of the other things that I did here was covered my brake line. Let's see if you can see. I've covered my brake line in abrasion resistant like fabric cover here, and then I've zip tied the ends. This is also something that I got off of McMaster. So I actually have braided steel lines, and they're fairly resilient. But when you've got sharp stones and other debris and maybe even wheel well liners flying apart in here and hitting your brake lines, you want as much protection as you can so you don't cut a line and find yourself flying off the edge of a berm because you didn't have brakes anymore. So obviously there's some trade-offs with this, right? It's great protection for the line, but you don't want to be running this on your daily driver because this is going to collect moisture, it's going to collect dirt and salt and sand, and if you're just driving this every day and you're not cleaning this out or taking this fabric off and checking underneath, you're going to destroy the lines underneath much faster than you would if you left them alone. But if you're looking for protection when you're out on the track, then that's something you can use. The brake line itself is copper nickel line. You can get rolls of this very, very cheap from places like Summit Racing. It's easy to form by hand. It's excellent to run full length lines to the back of the car in one piece. So don't buy 6-foot lengths of brake line at your local AutoZone and then patch them together with couplers, and then you have 7 more leak points possible in the braking system. When you can get a coil of this copper nickel line for $20, $30 and then run a single piece brake line from the front to the rear and to all your mounting points. Here also I've changed where the brake line mounts. I've taken advantage of the copper nickel line to actually drill a hole right here and have as short a run of the line as possible in the actual wheel well. The stock location actually had it running under by the cross member here, and it was a few more inches exposed in the danger zone, as I'll say. And so anywhere possible, you're eliminating that, you're bringing it into the interior, you're protecting it. It's something that takes a little bit extra time, but it doesn't take any extra money. So it's just your own prep time to do these little things. So this is more of a service tip, but we keep a paint marker, and we actually mark all of the bolt and nut heads on the underside and on the suspension. And as long as you're not tackling this ridiculously muddy course, you're going to be able to pull into service and then look at the paint marks and see instantly if something shifted or loosened up or moved. And that's just a great sanity check to avoid driving off with a potentially bad situation if you don't have time to check every single nut and bolt with a physical wrench. So a Subaru specific tech tip is the main harness from the engine bay into the interior actually runs underneath the driver's side fender. And if you take the wheel well liner off, you can see this. It's a big bundle. It's right there. And it's totally unprotected if the liner comes off. So if you lose the liner and then you've got water or stones flying up there, you run the risk of running into major issues. So protect that via some other method than the wheel well liner, because you can be sure that that's probably going to come off at some point. I've actually got a piece of 1/8 inch UHMW plastic. And again, I got sheets of UHMW from McMaster. That's going to be what you want for underbody protection, for mud flaps, for wheel scrapers. So between 1/8 inch and 3/16 of an inch, you're going to use that all over the car. So it's well worth the investment. So I've actually screwed a sheet up in there to cover the engine harness and make sure that it takes a little more effort if something's going to get up there and cause me trouble electrically. So we've got a few more things going on in the wheel well that's a little more advanced than the Grassroots prep that I wanted to talk about. There's some stitch welding and seam sealing and things like that. We'll get to that in another video. So let's take a look at the underbody of the car. So one of the other things that you can do with not much more than a moderate time investment is make wheel scrapers. And what wheel scrapers are going to do is it's going to take all the rocks and debris and chuck them out of the inside of the wheel before they actually roll into the caliper. So with a rally car, you're going to have smaller wheel sizes, and that puts the calipers on most of these cars very, very close to the inside of the rim. So even if you get a small pebble stuck in between the caliper and the wheel, it's going to act like a lathe, and it's going to turn a groove right into your wheel, and it can actually separate the wheel entirely or cause you some major issues. So this is a pretty simple wheel scraper. I made a mild steel bracket. I welded a nut on, and then I took a piece of UHMW plastic, 3/16, and I just roughly cut it to the shape of the inner barrel of the wheel. And it's mounted via a single bolt, and it's angled so it pitches all that rock and dirt and anything that gets inside of the wheel out of the rim towards the inside here. And that's right before the caliper there. So we're just getting all that out of the inside barrel before it ever has a chance to get wedged between the caliper and the wheel. And that's a single bolt mounting point there. Depending on your setup, you might have to do something more complex, come off of a caliper bolt location, weld something to the spindle, but it shouldn't take much more than that. So one of the other neat tricks that I see people doing underneath is with the bottom of the oil pan. Now, for any sort of serious rallycross car, you're going to have a skid plate underneath, and that's good. That's fine to protect the exhaust and your oil pan. But if you get out into rally sprints or stage rally, you run into some unique problems. Now you've got a lot of smaller rocks that might end up on top of this skid plate over the course of time. And then if these rocks happen to be between your skid plate and your oil pan, when you take a big hit on the skid plate, you just punched a hole in your oil pan. So how do you keep those rocks away from the oil pan? what I've done here is I've bonded a piece of high density foam to the bottom of the oil pan, and this takes up the distance between the pan and the skid plate. So this prevents any sort of sharp stones from getting in that 1-inch gap between the pan and the skid plate and possibly causing me issues here. So now I've got this nice cushion that even if I bend the heck out of the skid plate, I know I'm never really in danger of damaging the pan or punching a hole in it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the first video. If you have questions on anything that I showed, by all means ask and I'll respond, and I'll try to even address that in some of the later videos. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching.